Welcome to another episode of the Shade and Shit Talking Podcast. I'm your host, TK, and as always, I thank you for tuning in. Now, this episode, I'm going to just get right into it. I dropped a promo earlier this week talking about suicide amongst Black children, young Black children, starting at the age of 5. And like I said on the promo, I'll be joined by the one, the only Dr.Colibri Jenkins. She's a resident mental health professional for Black with No Chase, a very smart, brilliant lady. So without further ado, welcome back to the podcast, Colibri.
Thanks, Tyrus. You're too kind with all your accolades. But I appreciate you taking the time to talk about suicide in the Black community. That's something that we often sweep under the rug, and I'm glad that Black with No Chaser has such a large platform to educate and influence so many people and help them understand that mental illness is real. It's an issue in the Black community, and it's something that is bubbling to the surface. I've seen posted on the page, different articles about mental health and, seeing a therapist, and we can't just pray it away, down to Taraji P. Henson opening her mental health facility. So even though it's taboo in the Black community, we are making some strides when it comes to dealing with our mental health. So I appreciate Black with No Chaser stepping up to the plate to help us combat the ills of mental illness.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. I remember we talked about back during Mental Health Awareness Week with yourself and Lars and Brandy.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about a lot of different aspects of mental health, and you actually brought it up, back then. You was kind of ahead of the curve back then with talking about it, but we was talking about so much we really couldn't get to it. So
Yeah.
I always kept this in the back of my mind that I wanted to talk to you about it. And when I reached out to you, I had just saw like 2 heartbreaking stories of, 2 young children. I think one was 8 and the other might have been 11 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And it just blew me away to see, children so young
Mm-hmm.
taking their own lives. So
And
naturally I reached out to you.
And I think some of the reason that it hits us so hard is because we don't think to talk to people, specifically in this age range that we're talking about, 5 to 11 or so, 11 or 12. We don't think to talk to them about how they're feeling emotionally. We don't think to talk to them about, whether or not they've ever thought about it. We're afraid that it's too traumatizing for them. But study after study has shown that talking to young people, even as young as 5, about wanting to die or not wanting to live anymore, does not put the thought of death or wanting to die or committing suicide in their minds. What it does is it finds those kids who don't yet have the vocabulary to say to you, I don't want to be here anymore. I hurt so bad that I want to go to sleep and just never wake up. So talking to young people is by far the best thing that you can do. It's not traumatizing to them. It is not something that is going to make them fearful. It just gives them the tools to then be able to say, yeah, I'm having that problem. And it kind of normalizes it. So that's a good thing. So we need to just get into the mindset of talking to our young people about it.
Exactly. And I remember, you saying, back in May, about how mental health is like a stigma to the Black community.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk so much about ways to combat, that stigma and bring it to the forefront. So like, oh man, well, let me ask you this. What are some of the like symptoms or some of the things that we as a parent could look for or should look for when it comes to situations like this?
Okay, so in your young children, ages 5 to 11, you want to look for changes in behavior. Well, in all children, you want to look for changes in behavior, but it's a little bit easier to see in young kids because it's not characterized as, oh, he's just or she's just being a moody teenager. You want to look for a kid that used to be happy-go-lucky, smiling all the time, who is now isolating from friends or not wanting to talk or spending way too much time in their room, a kid that's not eating or sleeping way too much. The most common sign of depression in a young person is irritability. It's not actual, I'm crying all the time. It is literally, you can't say anything to them without them blowing up. And you can see that in a 7-year-old and an 8-year-old who has typically not been like that. So I like to tell parents, anything that gives you pause to say, this is not the kid that I normally see, it oftentimes can be something that is leading down a road that you don't want them to go down. The other thing is, parents need to be aware that if there's a family history of depression or anything like that in the family, that a kid could be more likely to suffer those kind of emotions earlier in life. If you're a mom or a parent who suffered depression at the age of 20, it is likely that you will have a kid who might see those symptoms earlier in life. So as a teenager or a tween. So just being aware of those kinds of things, looking for them in your children, that just really, those are the things you have to see. My kid isn't the normal kid that I'm used to.
Right. Now, do you think, and like I have been, reading different things, and, people are always quick to assess blame to everybody and everything. But I saw a story that talked about like the roles of schools, bullying in schools and things of that nature. Do you think that plays a huge part of it, or is it just a cop out to people not paying attention to their children?
I think bullying is real. I think bullying has always been around, but when we were younger, we had true social networks. We had friends that could, that could buffer that bullying that was going on. Nowadays, with the advent of social media, children are more and more isolated, and they're in their own little vacuum. So when the bullying occurs, it tears at their self-esteem more so now than it did back in the day when we had a serious social network. So I do think that bullying is a big deal. And I think that bullying has a much greater effect on young children, ages 5 to 11, than it does on older adolescents, those kids who are actual teenagers, just because they've learned some coping skills, and the little kids don't have as many coping skills. So I do think that bullying plays a role, but I think it's an onion. There are many layers to it. So if we want to talk about risk factors would be things like a history of depression, someone in your family with a history of mental illness. And it's weird for me to say this, but children under the age of 11 sometimes have a history of substance abuse or alcoholism. So if you are a young kid who has started drinking beer at the age of 7, that puts you at risk for suicide. If you've ever had a previous suicide attempt, or you have a family member who has attempted suicide or completed suicide, that puts you at greater risk. So there are a lot of risk factors out there that we know across the board affect children, no matter what age, what color. But there are things that are popping up now in the research that we are trying to determine how much of an effect they have on African American youth. I used to work in New Orleans, and in that city, chronic poverty and chronic trauma. And when I say chronic trauma, I mean I would have patients who would come to see me who 3 months ago a brother was shot and killed. And last week, a friend was shot and killed next door, and they literally had to walk over the body. So when you're constantly seeing these kind of traumatic events and you don't have a good coping system or social system, these things tend to weigh on you in a way that a more affluent or another type of individual that doesn't live in that urban setting, they tend to influence you a little bit more or a little differently. Chronic poverty leads to stuff like, having unsafe playgrounds, or losing a parent or a sibling to murder, or not really having access to health care. And when I say health care, I mean mental health care. So there could be issues going on with the kid, and mom or dad doesn't have a way to get them evaluated by a psychiatrist or a psychologist. And those problems just bubble over, whereas other populations and socioeconomic statuses may have access to that. So those things weigh heavier on the African American community than they do necessarily on those other populations. So there's a lot of stuff that happens and that goes on that affect us differently. Because just think about it. If you're a kid who's afraid to go outside and play, or they've had a friend who caught a stray bullet, or was hit by a car, or their friend is being abused physically or sexually by a parent, then that leads to feelings of hopelessness and worthlessness. And those are things that we know affect young people and cause them to commit suicide. So there are a lot of different factors that are popping up that we need to look into. And unfortunately, it takes years to gather this data. So in 2019, we're working off data that was started to be collected in 1999, 2000. So that shows you how long we have to wait to get, information that gives us some hard proof. But, at least we have people looking at it and working on those things right now.
Right. Now, you just said, it's a couple of things that you said that made me think back to our first couple of conversations. And, how we talk on Black No Chase all the time, whether we on the page or, in our private group where we talk about like the discrepancy in, the quality of life. And it amazes me. Well, it doesn't amaze me, but it's very glaring how much socioeconomic ability factors into everything. Like we talk about mental health. I remember we talked about the podcast about AIDS for HIV Awareness Week. We talked about it for breast cancer. I mean,
it permeates everything. It permeates it all. And it's sad.
Exactly.
Because our system is set up in a way that there are institutional racist policies that keep us at a disadvantage. And it's not just an economic disadvantage. That economic disadvantage leads to us being disproportionately affected by nearly every ill that this country experiences. The saying that when the country has a cold, the Black community has the flu, it's true. It's true in all aspects of life, whether that's economic, whether that's housing, whether that is job availability, whether that is healthcare. In every silo of American culture, that holds true.
Yes, indeed.
It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. So, the other piece of this is, I know we're talking about suicide rates. And even though the suicide of a child, and when I say a child, I mean ages 5 to 11 or 12 or so, even though that's rare, the rate at which children are killing themselves is increasing. So the top 3 causes of death in kids ages 5 to 12 is accidents, cancer, and then suicide. So the rate that suicide occurs now is 1 child under the age of 12 dies every 5 days from suicide. So that's 1 kid, 12 and under, every 5 days is killing him or herself. So in a 30-day month, we lose 6 children to suicide. That's a lot of little kids. It's a
You're
lot
right.
of little kids.
I
Because we
mean,
don't think that they are going through this type of turmoil. We don't talk to them, but they are.
losing one is one too many, you know.
Yes.
So just, and I mean, as a parent, just to hear this type of stuff really scares me. And even though, you know, my wife and myself, we talk to our children every single day. You know, we sit down and we talk about it and everything. We, you know, we create an environment where they can be open and
Mm-hmm.
honest
Mm-hmm.
without, you know, being scared or without worrying about, you know, me, you know, whooping them or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because we really think that, you know, that's important. And, you know, I feel blessed to know that, if they needed somebody to talk to, I have the ways and means to, you know, get it done immediately.
Right. And that's a
But,
luxury
you
that
know,
so many people don't have.
right. And that's why, you know, we do what we do, you know, because a lot of stuff that we talk about here isn't about us per se. It's about, you know, those disenfranchised and those less fortunate than us, because, you know,
Mm-hmm.
we blessed.
Right.
And I freely admit that. But I can't close myself off from the rest of the, you know, my people because I
Right.
quote unquote made it or whatever.
Right, 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 right. You still got to do it for the culture. You know, just to have a couple people make it and not reach back is not the way that we want to live life. We want to pull the whole community with us. You know, so making sure that we let families know this type of information so they can start talking to their children, and being just having it on your mind, because if it's not on your mind, there's no way for you to look for it. There's no way for you to be assessing for it. So just being able to talk about it is a blessing. Be able to impart that knowledge with some people, you know, it's invaluable. Another thing that I want to make sure that I got out to the audience is that when we talk about young children, and adolescents who commit suicide, we're talking about, I'm going to tell you what it looks like. So you have more African American males who commit suicide. Those African American males that do commit suicide are oftentimes dealing with stressful situations at home or with their friends. Now, how many times did your mom tell you when you were a kid that you didn't have a care in the world? You had nothing to worry about. That's what my mama and daddy said all the time, because I didn't have adult cares or adult worries, but my little social circles were real. And if it was something going on in that social circle, it really affected me. So I think that we have to be careful when we dismiss what our children are telling us, because sometimes they're telling us the things that we need to hear, but because we're dealing with our own, we oftentimes don't hear it or we dismiss it. So African American males in stressful situations at home and or with friends leads to suicide. The other thing is that in the African American community, there are a lot of young people who are diagnosed with ADHD. And one of the most common symptoms of ADHD is, outside of the attention span difficulties, is impulsivity. So when you look at a kid who has committed suicide, it is more likely that that kid has ADHD than not, because that impulsivity has taken control. In a situation that seems like, oh my God, I can't get out of it, they do something impulsively that, had they not had those issues, they may not have necessarily acted on them or taken their lives. So I always talk to my parents of young African American boys about, you know, how they're feeling, not to dismiss it, not to fuss at them for crying, allow them to express their emotions, because this is a population that's at risk more so than the, you know, young girl with depression, because you would automatically think, oh, it's the depressed kid that kills themselves. Actually, it's the kid that's impulsive and does something drastic without thinking about the consequences. So yes, kids with depression do kill themselves, but we need to also be looking at the impulsivity related to ADHD and kids who are going through stressful situations.
You talked about this, the numbers being disproportionate.
Mm-hmm.
And like, as I was, reading different things about this, and I might have mentioned partially on the little promo,
Mm-hmm.
but from 2001 to 2015,
Mm-hmm.
kids ages 5 to 17, there was 1,661 deaths.
Mm-hmm.
But what struck me about that, and you kind of touched on it a few minutes ago, was that it was a 3-to-1 ratio
Mm-hmm.
between boys to girls, 74% boys to 26% girls.
Mm-hmm.
But the part that I read, it really didn't say that they found like any particular reason why, the numbers, mesh out like that. But kind of hearing the way you explained it, it makes a lot of sense
Mm-hmm.
to me, because I remember, growing up running with my friends, I faced a lot of, stressful situations, doing things here and there, and
Mm-hmm.
very impulsive. I was very impulsive as a child. Thank goodness I made it out of that. But,
Mm-hmm.
what you said made a lot of sense to me, and I hope it makes a lot of sense to people listening.
I hope so, because I look at everything as a cycle. We have our experiences and we are midway through our cycle, but we're also parenting little people who are just starting their cycles. So we can look at ourselves and see a pattern and then be able to look at our kids and say, okay, do I see the same things? I know that I was impulsive. My kid may be impulsive. What is it that I need to do in order to step in between this to help them? I think oftentimes when it comes to our young Black boys, we don't give them an avenue to release whatever they're feeling. The only avenue is to fight. And I don't want to get on toxic masculinity or anything like that, but some of those denials of their avenues create a volcano that could erupt at any minute. And if we are not careful to not cut off the avenues of being able to express themselves freely or crying or talking it out without dismissing them, we run the risk of putting them in the line of fire that leads them, down this pathway. The other thing that I want to make sure that I touch on is that the reason that another reason that boys account for a greater number of suicides is because, again, especially in urban areas, is the access to means to kill themselves. Boys are going to use guns. Girls are going to take pills. The thing that is more likely to kill you is a gun. Taking pills, somebody finds me, pumps my stomach, I'm probably going to make it. But if I shoot myself in the head, then the likelihood that I'm going to pull through that is pretty low. So access to weapons, access to guns is a major, major issue when it comes to African-American males committing suicide, because especially in urban areas, the access is the guns are just readily available.
Actually, I read that a little earlier. It was talking about the same thing. And it also mentioned that not only pills, but like girls would commit suicide through some form of strangulation as well.
Hanging, yeah, definitely.
Like I said, just one is one too many. And I really don't know like what it is that we can do to combat this, other than just plugging away at it constantly, talking to our children and constantly talking to other children. And like I pay attention to my kids' friends when they come over,
Yes.
like to see how they are, and because sometimes they may be crying out for help, and you don't want to see it.
That's absolutely correct. I think we have to get back to it takes a village to raise a child. I think we have to get back to that, because if we don't, you just have a parent trying to look out, and it's impossible for us as parents to see everything that relates to our children. So I think that's very important. The other thing that you said is absolutely correct. We have to keep plugging away at this. We have to keep talking about it. We have to normalize it as much as possible. And I think we've made amazing strides in decreasing the stigma. We've got a very long way to go, but we've done amazingly well. I was preparing for a community event on Saturday, and I was at an apartment complex passing out some flyers about the event. And the lady asked, well, what is this doctor going to talk about? And I told her that I was a psychiatrist and I was the doctor on the page. And she immediately started to talk about, oh, I got family members that need to talk to you. And 15 years ago, that never would have happened. But it's because we've talked about it that people are starting to see that maybe seeing a psychiatrist has some benefits. So if we keep doing this, the slow and steady, pace of chiseling away at the problem, I think we'll end up in a good space. The question is, what do we do to save those babies in the meantime? And I think we have to rally around them, because sometimes when you look at, the very young children who commit suicide, there are developmental things that are happening there. They just have not developed the abilities to cope with certain things. So when you destroy the family and the social networks, or they just aren't there, you put those young people at risk for committing suicide. So I think it's important for the village to just rally around these young people and make sure that we're all taking a look and seeing what's going on. And if you see something, say something. It may turn out to be nothing, but if that parent is a real parent, they'll appreciate the fact that, hey, somebody is looking out for the best interest of my kid. I might not have saw it, but at least they were trying to help. And I think that's the attitude that we in the Black community have to take, instead of one of defense. You're trying to put my child down or say something negative. We have to get to the point where we embrace all the help that we can get. So, I think that's where we have to head. Chisel away at the problem. Look out for everybody's kids around you, and make sure if you see something, you say something. So those are the things that I think are going to be most helpful. One thing that I did want to talk about, TK, before we end our conversation is, when you put up the promo for this event, there was an individual who said that, this might be due to all the medicines that we're, trying to force down kids' throats. When I decided, I wanted to say something then, but I didn't. I said, I'm going to hold off. When I decided I was going to be a psychiatrist, I, number one, did not believe in ADHD. And I felt like it was a ploy to just over-medicate our little boys. But I've seen it firsthand, and it's really real. But the other thing is when I first started training, we were coming off SSRIs, which are antidepressants, being labeled with a black box warning saying that, these drugs could increase suicidal thoughts in anybody under the age of 24. So because pediatricians prescribed more antidepressants than psychiatrists, the pediatricians decided that they would just stop treating depression altogether. And if you look at the way the data was planted, as the number of prescriptions for antidepressants dropped off, meaning that pediatricians stopped treating kids for depression, the number of suicides went through the roof. So people say, oh, it's the medicines that are making it do it, that are making them, commit suicide. We have solid evidence that says the complete opposite. Not treating children who display signs and symptoms of depression or suicidality, not treating those symptoms, ignoring it, not giving them the medicines, has led to a drastic increase in the number of suicides. So I do understand people's thoughts about, we're just giving kids too much medicine. But if that kid was a type 1 diabetic, nobody would be saying, stop giving your child insulin, because they don't want them to die. And I look at it the same way with brain disease, because that's what depression is. That's what suicidal thoughts are. It is a manifestation of a brain disease. So if we're not going to tell our type 1 diabetic not to take his or her insulin, we shouldn't be telling our depressed young people not to take their medicines.
I totally agree. Totally agree. I actually had a family member who was taking it, and I'm 40, so this was 34, 35 years ago.
This is Ritalин's heyday.
Yeah, and it was, it was taboo then, but my grandmother was a nurse, and she had a psychologist friend. So, she trusted her, so that's how he ended up taking it. But, I remember like vividly that the rest of the family just wasn't having that shit.
Right.
They didn't want to talk about it. They didn't feel right about it, but it really helped him because he's very successful now. It helped him through, his youth. I think he was off by the time we were like 12 or 13, but those first few years, it was critical for him.
And that's the other thing. It doesn't have to be something that you're necessarily doing lifelong. There are times when I'm a person who advocates. I'm a person who advocates medications and therapy together. I don't think either one of them alone works as well as both of them together. So I advocate the both of them. So there are some cases of depression where you can take the medicines and do some serious therapy and be able to get off of those medications because you've learned, how to retrain your thoughts to not lead you down some of these roads that get you stuck. So, I think that it's a twofold thing. You need to do the medicines, but you also need to do the therapy. And just because you're diagnosed or have an issue with depression or anxiety, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a lifelong journey with medications. It's an individual thing between you, your doctor, and your therapist, but I wouldn't necessarily go down the road saying, oh, I'm gonna have to take this until I'm 90.
Right. Now, I know I've held you up, and I know Miles been trying to hit this all night. Ready for his mama.
Miles is glad that I'm preoccupied, so he does not have to be in the bed.
But before you get out of here, I just want to say, as always, I appreciate you stopping by. I appreciate, you always take the time to research everything and you come with it every single time. And I just can't, thank you enough for that.
No problem.
Also, and I've told you this a million times, you really should get your own show. Like, you know we got Black with No Chaser TV coming up. We got, Black with No Chaser radio. Like you really got, away with this. And I think you should really, look into it. I think you can help a lot of people on a bigger platform. So I'm
gonna get myself together and get it done.
I hope so.
I promise I'm gonna get myself together.
But as always, I appreciate you stopping by.
Thank you for having me. I always enjoy it.
Any parting thoughts you want to leave everybody before you go?
I just want to remind people that, number one, there are risk factors. Previous history of depression, previous history of suicide attempts, family history of suicide, or family history of mental illness. Those are the young people that we need to be paying more attention to. We also need to make sure that people who live in chronic poverty or experience chronic trauma, we need to make sure that we are wrapping our arms around them to make sure that we can see if there are changes in behavior. And once you see changes in behavior, we need to be comfortable enough and confident enough to be able to go to that parent and say, hey, I love you and I love your kids. This is what I see. I don't know if it's anything, but this is what I see. And I want to make sure you know what I see so you can do whatever you think is necessary. It takes a village. It takes a village. Once we get back to those roots, once we start to anchor, ourselves as a community and become community minded, I think we can tackle some of these problems, even if the external forces that are leading us down this path don't necessarily change, we are able to become self-sufficient in saying, I know what to look for. I know how we can get some services, and this is what we need to do. I think that will impact us greatly.
Ladies and gentlemen, the brilliant, the great, the smart, the dedicated, the excellent Dr. Colibri Jenkins.
Thank you, TK.
I appreciate you stopping by. If you or someone you know is having thoughts of suicide, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK, that's 1-800-273-8255, or the crisis text line, text TALK to 741-741. They are free 24-hour services that can provide support, information, and resources. Again, that's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255, or the crisis text line, text TALK to 741-741.
The podcast you just heard was made using Anchor. Ever thought about making your own podcast? Anchor makes it really easy for anyone to get started. It's a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing podcasts. Best of all, it's 100% free. Sign up now at anchor.fm/new. That's anchor.fm/new to get started.